Welcome to the Far and Beyond podcast, hosted by the Contracts and Fiscal Law Department at the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School. This podcast is for the federal government attorney navigating the complex intersection of acquisitions and fiscal law and policy. I am your host, Major Ellie Sewell.
And as always, I'm Major Ed Callahan.
We often talk about major regulatory overhauls, but sometimes the biggest changes come from simple math, inflation. So today, we're going to dig into the inflation adjustments, which the FAR Council recently finalized, making massive changes to the spending thresholds we all rely on.
So the Federal Acquisition Regulation, or FAR, has a spectrum of procedures that are required based on the total cost of the acquisition, which means that the more expensive the item gets, the more procedures are going to be required. We've always thought of these in like three different buckets or categories. You have purchases below the micro-purchase threshold, purchases between the micro-purchase threshold and the simplified acquisition threshold, and then everything else above the simplified acquisition threshold.
Exactly, and it's important to understand that all of these thresholds are only directly applicable to FAR-based transactions. So the micro-purchase threshold was $10,000 for a few years now. And then often you use the GPC or the government purchase card without much hassle, whether you were buying a commercial item or non-commercial item. The simplified acquisition threshold used to sit at $250,000. Everything below that threshold was a streamlined acquisition, and everything above meant more onerous contracting rules kicked in. So think your FAR Part 15, FAR Part 14 for those types of acquisitions.
Right, and the purpose of these things was, for example, using under the micro-purchase threshold with the GPC, our commands could acquire what they wanted within 3 days. If you were between the GPC micro-purchase threshold and the simplified acquisition threshold, it was usually within 30 days. Above that, we're measuring it in months because you're going through the more onerous procedures found in parts
Months.
14, 15.
Years.
Yeah, exactly right. Now, these changes, which were effective as of October 1st of this year, are pretty substantial for helping us out. The standard micro-purchase threshold is jumping from $10,000 to $15,000. This is giving a 50% more spending power for routine open market buys using the GPC, which, let's not forget, is a required method for micro-purchases in all but very few exceptions.
And I also understand that the AFARS, the Army Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, Appendix EE, governs GPC operations.
Yeah, that's right.
So since AFARS procedures implement and supplement DoD policy and the Army's GPC limits are governed by FAR Part 2 definition, the cardholder's single purchase limits will automatically or quickly need to reflect the new $15,000 limit.
Yeah, that's correct. And as a matter of fact, the same register that put out this change also amended FAR Part 201 to make sure that it reflected the changes when they go through. However, the tables in Appendix EE have yet to be changed. So that's just something we as the legal advisors need to be paying attention to, that while that hasn't changed, it cross-references the micro-purchase threshold, which has changed.
I think there's a lot of change coming to the AFARS.
Right. I think that's right.
So the MPT does not always mean the same dollar value, right? Though there are circumstances which trigger higher thresholds, even though the name remains the same.
That's right. Sounds like maybe you attended my class when we teach this very specific thing. So there are a couple instances when the micro-purchase threshold is different. So you have emergency type operations, or ETOs as they refer to in the Federal Register. The micro-purchase threshold for contracts performed inside the U.S. is now $25,000. So that used to be $20,000. If you're outside the U.S., it's now $40,000 where it used to be $35,000. So this is reflecting the immediate nature that these emergencies have, that they're not, or they're increasing this threshold to allow for a more expedited ability for these cardholders to go out and get what they need when you're in emergency type situations, both CONUS and OCONUS. What you have to remember, though, is that this isn't automatic, right? Mm-hmm. Your cardholders have to be registered personnel identified, trained, and appointed in the JAM, which is the Joint Appointment Module. It's not just any cardholder that faces an emergency. They have to be specifically designated and trained as such.
Okay, so to be clear, we've just been talking about purchases of supplies. But what about the thresholds for construction and services under the MPT?
Right. So those are governed actually by they're statutory numbers. So it's not going to be subject to these reviews that the FAR does. And, these were put out notifications back in November. There was a year of comment because these are agency rules that are going through. The specific numbers, $2,000 threshold for construction under Davis-Bacon, $2,500 for services under the Service Contract Act. Those came from statutory numbers, so those don't change like the others do.
Okay, so that makes sense. So I think we've covered everything with the micro purchase threshold and the GPC, but what about the simplified acquisitions threshold?
Yeah, the simplified acquisitions threshold is jumping from $250,000 to $350,000.
Big jump.
It is, though it's not a surprising number, I think, for a lot of us who have had the exceptions granted for $350,000. And all of this is based off of inflation. The items that you used to be able to purchase effectively for under $250,000 now just cost us up to $350,000.
And that streamlining applies to the special ETO stats, which saw similar leaps?
Yeah, that's right. So unlike what we talked about as the statutory governance of the construction under Davis-Bacon Service Contract Act, ETOs, to remind everybody what we just talked about, are the emergency type operations. So we had those limits increased for us from 1.5 million to 2 million for work outside the U.S., inside the U.S. from 800,000 up to 1 million. This specifically, just like we talked about before, are for warranted ETO contracting cardholders. All right, even more so than what they were before when we talked about just trained in the jam. These are ones who are already contracting officers. They're identified and can use the GPC up to these increased SAT levels. Just like everything we began talking about, when you have lower dollar threshold, we assume more risk. We have more people with access to it. Now we're talking about giving someone a credit card with a $2 million limit, right?
I was a little surprised about that.
That's right. So we're going to make sure that you are a contracting officer, that you're warranted to do this before we're giving you that kind of immediate response with that much money.
So these big changes were solely due to the inflation adjustment rule found in 41 U.S.C. 1908, not the revolutionary FAR overhaul?
Yeah, that's right. The threshold changes we discussed are solely due to the inflation adjustment rule. This happens every 5 years. Notification periods, all that stuff. This was put in place and notification went out in November of 2024, far earlier than the revolutionary FAR overhauls that we're all working through and adjusting to now.
Okay, that makes sense because the FAR overhaul really is focusing on what rules apply to what kind of purchases regardless of the dollar amount.
Yeah, that's right. And as we're talking about it, let's not forget that there's some additional thresholds that have changed, right? Mm-hmm. So we talked earlier about our micro purchase threshold. We talked earlier about our simplified acquisition threshold. But those thresholds are also different for purchasing commercial products, all right? That threshold was previously 7.5 million. Now that one's gone up to 9 million to reflect the exact same increase in inflation.
Okay, but the commercial contingency threshold did not increase the ceiling, leaving it fixed at 15 million for specific contingency related commercial acquisitions?
Yeah, that's right. So that's the one threshold that could be changed by the inflation adjustment rule that did not change. Okay. So the highest that we have is for contingency threshold commercial items, $15 million. So let's dive into the practical reality of these increases. What do the changing numbers mean for our day-to-day? When the government changes a threshold, it's not just moving a number. It's changing the workload and the level of scrutiny applied to thousands of transactions. Historically, shifting these goalposts meant less administrative burden overall, but it requires immediate clarity on authority. Under the old rules, we knew exactly who could use the GPC up to $10,000 micro purchase limit. Now everything's increasing. We can assume it's going to be the same people allowed to, but we don't know that for sure yet.
All right, let's just start with the sheer numbers, pulling directly from the Federal Procurement Data System, FPID. Is it FPIDS?
I've never heard it referred to as that, but I guess we can make up stuff we do all the time. How you doing, Chow?
So this data covers fiscal years 2022 through 2024. On average, contracts valued at or below the old micro purchase threshold, so 10,000, totaled just over 560,000 federal awards annually. So the data shows that between the old 10,000 threshold and the new $15,000 threshold, there contained another 49,000 awards.
Yeah, that's right. And so that comes out to around 9%, which means that we just made 9% more actions eligible for this very, very streamlined micro purchase threshold GPC purchase. And like we talked about earlier, that means 9% more things are getting to commands within days of their identification of the need.
Now, it doesn't really sound big, but when you do think about 9%, that's also 9% off the workload of, your contracting office who would normally be doing these, and putting it in the hands of your requiring activity.
That's absolutely right. And, as legal advisors, generally speaking, we're not doing a lot of reviews on the micro purchase threshold GPC purchases. So that's a large percentage that aren't coming through us. Now, don't forget, these things are still subject to protests. We should still do some preemptory training with all of our GPC card holders to make sure that they know the difference. But this is going to streamline a lot of the procedures. And this is what we hear Sec War, Sec Army talking a lot about, is streamlining these procedures, getting into units things faster as they need them.
And just as a reminder, a lot of times we do not see these GPC purchases until they go wrong. So
That's right.
It is always good to make sure that the training and the correct procedures are being followed to prevent those issues.
That's absolutely right.
All right, so let's move on to the SAT. So the change to the SAT threshold from 250,000 to 350,000 impacts efficiency too. So the average annual actions between the old micro purchase threshold and the old SAT totaled roughly 235,000 contract actions.
Yeah, that's right. And based on what they released, that's an additional 5,150 simplified actions annually are going to fit under this increased threshold, right? That means they can avoid the more complex, generally required above the SAT. They're going to fall into what's now FAR Part 13, though we anticipate that changing going through. Now, that's not as high a percentage. I think that's 2 to 3%. But it's still a lot that are going to be able to go through.
That's 5,000 actions, again, getting taken out of FAR Part 14 and 15 and moving into 13 or FAR Part 12 and 13 now. That is still another big workload that you're just taking off of the KOs and just moving them just down to less.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think that's the point of these reviews and increasing these thresholds. And again, I think it meets guidance that we're receiving from Sec War, Sec Army.
All right, so the fundamental purchase authority for a typical card holder has changed. The goal here is to maintain the status quo by adjusting for inflation, thus preventing burdensome requirements from applying to more and more acquisitions as the dollar loses its value.
That's right. So for Army personnel, the GPC structure is anchored by the GPC delegation of authority. And like we talked about before, this comes from the joint appointment module. Now the micro purchase threshold is going to be up to $15,000. Not that anybody at $10,000 shouldn't have been screened and reviewed appropriately, but now we're going up with more money. We're giving more trust to folks. Just as a reminder, generally, only a government employee or a member of the armed forces can even be appointed as a cardholder. They must have that proper JAM appointment and mandatory training. This isn't something that someone who happens to have free time can become your GPC cardholder for. But I got to be honest with you, Ellie, I've never dealt with it on the Air Force side. So what about the Department of the Air Force? As they operate under their own system governed by, is it DAFI 64117? How does that work?
Yep, Daffy's right. The threshold adjustments are effective across the board, including for the Department of the Air Force. Since the DAFI bases its limits on the definitions found in FAR Part 2, the standard micro-purchase threshold authority for card holders automatically increased from $10,000 to $15,000. The same instant increases apply to contingency buys, the MPT for purchases outside the U.S., and ETOs goes up to $40,000. And then the DAFI also confirms that this program is mandatory and provides a simplified, streamlined method for purchasing supplies, services, and making contract payments for the Air Force. So again, compliance involves a deep tiered hierarchy, requiring training every 2 years for all GPC roles, from the component program manager down to the cardholder.
Okay, so it sounds like the DAFI reflects the same rules that we have. As I understand it, though, the DAFI doesn't apply to the Air National Guard, does it?
No, so with the Air National Guard, I do believe they actually follow the Army rules. They don't follow the DAFI. So if you are in the Air National Guard, double check your rules and your processes. Make sure you're following the correct guidance.
So it sounds like the Air National Guard has actually made the right decision and decided to follow the Army. That makes sense.
I don't know about that.
All right, so let's recap a little bit here. It seems like the Air Force and the Army are in lockstep with this. Our thresholds have changed. $15,000 for our micro purchase threshold, $350,000 for our simplified acquisition threshold. This is going to allow thousands more contracts, thousands more streamlined effect, and much faster fielding of equipment after it's needed to the commands, both in the Air Force and in the Army.
Yep. It's increased spending limits for virtually every GPC user. And just make sure you're looking to your own department's instructions and policy guidance as they change with these new updates to the thresholds.
That's right. Yeah. And they were all effective as of 1 October of this year, right?
Yes.
Because as we've said a few times, this isn't related to the Revolutionary Fire overhaul. This was things that have been in motion for just about a year now.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Far and Beyond. Please make sure to follow us and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform.
We love to hear from our listeners. Please continue to reach out to us on Facebook and LinkedIn. I don't really have either one of those things, but I'm sure someone's paying attention to them. The information can be found in the show notes for today's episode.
The views expressed today are those of the presenters, not that of the Judge Advocate General Corps, the Department of the Army, Department of the Air Force, or the Department of War.